thanks for coming in. I realise you've all been to a lot of sessions. It's probably been very intense. You've had lunch as well, so we're hoping to be pretty lively, and it's a good day on which to talk about the US economy. We have been saying it's US economy gathering steam, question mark, yeah? And we may be talking somewhat about whether the economic signs are good, but the politics is broken. But we have several speakers here who know a lot more about this than I do. Greg Cappelli, thank you for being here. Ross DeVol, you probably know, who is going to also take us through some of those fundamentals and give us a bit more of an overview. Harold Ford with me here, Todd, Morley and Eric Spiegel. And I would like to start, actually, Harold, with you, because we've got the partial shutdown. There's a lot of negotiating to be done if we can get people to the table. We've got the debt ceiling crisis looming. What are the big questions to ask, the things that really need to be sorted first in Washington?
Well, we could do a 3-day conference on that
sure
question alone. And the prescience of Skip and Ross and Mike Milken to have us here on October 1, the day of a government shutdown in the U.S. is pretty amazing. I'd say two quick things. I think we're probably in for at least a week to 2 week shutdown of the government, largely because you have the looming questions around the debt ceiling. We've all learned that the 16th or the 17th, the Treasury won't be able to cover all of our bills, which could cause some damage to our credit rating. I think you have a group of Republicans in the House and the Senate who would love to cut a deal today with the president, raise the open government back up and raise the debt ceiling and move on to other conversations. Unfortunately, you have a group that's louder, perhaps a little larger in the House, commonly called the Tea Party, which has stood its ground around this Obamacare, around the Affordable Care Act. I think the things to watch for, we were talking a little bit about in the room, I think we may find ourselves in the next week or two where Paul Ryan may say to some 40 to 50 members of the Republican caucus, we cannot allow for the debt ceiling to be breached. Let us cut a deal with this White House and figure out ways to allow for health care to come back up a week or two after we get through this moment. If you recall last December when a deal was struck, it was Paul Ryan that played a key role. His voice has been conspicuously absent in this process so far. I think one of the national papers in the U.S. wrote about this in the last day or two. So I see him as one of the key players in all of this.
And you need those players, because one of the things we were just talking about is who are the deal makers? You know, who are the people who command respect from both sides in the way that Ted Kennedy would have done?
No doubt about it. Things happen fast. You think about 12 weeks ago, the American ire was directed in a big way at Vladimir Putin around Ed Snowden, and there was a big infatuation with this issue back in the States. 12 weeks later, he played a key role in helping America not really save the president, some of the rhetoric the president had around a red line in Syria. And if indeed we're able to find an agreement with the Iranians around these nuclear issues, think about it, 12 weeks ago, Putin was looked at in many ways in the U.S. as a great pariah. He could find himself 12 weeks later legitimately in the conversation for the Nobel Peace Prize if we avoid taking military action.
So you're saying the U.S. Congress ought to look at what's been done, take heart from what's been done to Vladimir Putin's reputation?
I'm trying to find positive in
that's
anything
good. I like that.
Philippa.
I like that.
So I appreciate you amplifying that point. I only make the point, these things happen very fast, and the next 2 weeks will be, unfortunately, highly interesting to watch.
Okay. Todd, Morley, are you fundamentally an optimist here when we look at the way that the political shenanigans are playing out?
Well, that I think is probably the least of it. Obviously, there's not much faith in our elected officials. We have a single-digit rating now, something like that, kind of unheard of. But I think the scarier thing is that my own belief is that we're in kind of the eye of the storm, and that we think we're in kind of an economic recovery, but the fact is that we're in very slow growth, and this is with the Fed stepping on the gas now for many years, and so we keep throwing trillions of dollars at the problem. We've already recreated a housing bubble. We have bubbles now in the stock market and the bond market, and there's a wonderful movie that just came out called Money for Nothing that everybody should look at. It's a 100-year study of the Fed. And it's just unsustainable. You just can't keep printing money and creating bubbles in hopes that you'll have this trickle down.
But if the Fed had started easing off the taper and we'd got to this point today with the shutdown, wouldn't the uncertainty, the lack of confidence be worse?
Well, The problem is there's no adult in the room anymore. And so the Fed's tapering, they're not tapering. You know, we used to look at Mr. Volcker and Greenspan and have a lot of faith. And so now it's unclear kind of who is in charge. And so I think they've sort of put themselves into a bind that'll be tough to get out of, notwithstanding the fact that we've already flooded the market with money.
Okay, perhaps it should have been called US Overview Eye of the Storm, but I'm going to gather contenders, I think, for the most accurate name for this session. Eric, just over to you for first thoughts about where we are now and how much political dysfunction can drag the economy down.
Well, you know, I think if you'd asked me that question 9 months ago, I was, pretty optimistic around where the U.S. market was going, where the economy was going. I mean, we're a pretty good proxy for just about all industries. We're big in energy and healthcare and infrastructure and also industrial and manufacturing. But this year has been pretty flat. The last 2 years we've had 8-9% growth in the U.S. We're largely capital spending tied to major capital. This year's been slow, and particularly for some sectors. But I think a lot of it has been driven by uncertainty. Some of it's been driven by what's been happening with the slowdown in China and also the recession in Europe. So exports are down. You know, we exported about $6 billion last year. We're going to be well below that this year in terms of what we export out of the U.S. But the uncertainty in the last 5 or 6 months has been unbelievable. I mean, we can point to hundreds of billions of dollars of projects that have now been on the drawing board, some for years, but many for months, with companies waiting to see what's going to happen with the budget for this year, what's going to be funded, what's not going to be funded.
Do you look at Congress and want to shake them collectively and think,
I do that
they
occasionally.
Just not get it?
I do that occasionally. It doesn't do much good, but yeah, I think it's very dysfunctional over there. I think a lot of people waiting to see, just basic things like the transportation bill, the R&D tax credit, the energy efficiency bill that was put forward. I mean, there's a lot of these things that companies can't take action, can't make investments until they know whether it's going to be in place or not. So I think that's slowing a lot of things down this year.
And that, again, is an eye of the storm issue, isn't it? A kind of feeling of being becalmed and not being able to jump forward for investment that is fundamental. Greg, your thoughts on where we are right now?
I guess I'm a little more optimistic. I mean, running one of the largest education companies in the world, I think
you have to be forward-thinking.
It's about educating the people too. We're still a relatively young country, and we blame the politicians in Washington. Congress has a low rating when we look at it, but we put those politicians in place in the House and the Senate, and people vote for them. So if they want to fix the problem, then put people in who are willing to compromise with each other, decide what they want America to be great at, and get to work. It's educating people further why we are where we are, what's happened with the people that we have in office. I'm not saying that they're not very intelligent people with their hearts in the right place, but you can fix it. It is a democracy. You don't like it, you can put people in place, they're going to get it done.
Ross, I want to come to you in just a minute. I just want to raise with Harold, you said one of the things that we have to watch, and I hadn't got this, is primary registration deadlines. You know, when you were talking about trying to undo the damage that's been done. So,
right, it's unfortunate that I think all the issues have been raised. I would agree with this. We talk about the uncertainty that looms, and we think about how you resolve some of this. And we were discussing a little bit in the green room. You look at the primary deadlines, Republican to file to run for office against incumbents. And it's really remarkable how much that's playing, I think, into who could side with President Obama and who can side with Nancy Pelosi if you're a Republican, who can side with Harry Reid. The big challenge in today's politics is people who follow U.S. politics is not whether or not you'll face an opponent from an opposite party member, but whether or not you're going to face an intramural race or what we call a primary contest. Mitch McConnell will virtually be absent from these big discussions, and his answers will be predictable in the coming weeks because he's facing a pretty tough Tea Party opponent in his home state. He needs Rand Paul's support, which clearly he enjoys right now, so he's not going to go around Rand Paul in the U.S. Senate. You look at John Cornyn, the number 2 Republican in the Senate. Not to get too much in the weeds, but these are just facts. He's could face a primary opponent. His filing deadline is not until mid-January in Texas, and he's worried that Ted Cruz may incite someone to run against him. So if you look at Paul Ryan, the kind of Republicans he could bring to a deal, you got to look at those Republicans whose filing deadlines have already passed, because if they go out and side with Obama on raising the debt ceiling without getting changes to Obamacare or whatever, they likely will encourage a primary opponent, which many of them don't want to do. Unfortunately, that's what American politics has become, just a basic time for them to act as if they're legislating as they wait to get to the midterms. And the midterms are now defined by whether or not you're going to face your own party opponent because you got to raise money and do all the things itself.
That is fascinating, because that's the hot tip, isn't it, for watching the short-term ebb and flow and what's behind the speeches and who's in what camp as we watch the tick down to October 16th/17th. But Ross, I want to come to you because we want to get an overview of political faction fighting aside, where the U.S. economy stands.
Well, I guess I'm the leading edge optimist on the panel. I would argue it's been remarkable how strong the U.S. economy has been and resilient given all the headwinds we faced. We had a tax increase on January 1, right? Personal income tax increase. Social Security tax that was temporarily suspended was reinstalled. We've had sequestration. That's taken somewhere between a percentage point to a percentage point and a half off of real GDP growth, yet we're growing somewhere close to 2%. So we do face a number of headwinds. One of them is our export markets have weakened. But if you go to slide 13, there's some deleveraging that's occurred on the consumer balance sheet in the United States. It's slide 13 showing the debt service burden in the United States. So I see this as the untold story. Now, granted, some of that was because some financial firms wrote off credit card debt, but consumers have taken their debt servicing burdens down from 14% at the crisis down to about 10.5%, and it looks like it's about bottomed out. So the consumer balance sheet has improved significantly. Now, that doesn't mean the consumer is going to be rip-roaring ahead, but what it suggests is underlying job growth of 170 to 200,000 a month, combined with still low interest rates, the consumer's in much better shape. And slide 14 shows you what consumers have been purchasing. So if you look at light vehicle sales, auto sales here, we're almost back to the previous peak before the recession. Now, you can make the argument that, well, that's zero interest rate financing. A lot of that is, it's easy money, no question about that. But the stock of cars on the highways in the United States is the oldest it's been ever. And with the zero interest rate financing, consumers have been going out spending again. It's consumer spending's up 2 to 2.5%. We need a bigger boost than that. But we commented a little bit about housing. If you go to slide 17, and Todd suggesting there's a bubble, I would say there's a mini bubble in some markets that was engineered by the Fed. But this is part of the wealth effect that's improving consumer confidence. You look at the stock market, housing prices back up. Now, the real risk is going to be the recent rise in mortgage rates. Because if you look at refinancing, people that have been on the fence trying to decide whether it's a good time to buy a home or not, they were shopping in a market where they could get a 30-year mortgage for 3 to 3.5%. Today, it's back to 4.5%. So they're trying to decide, well, can I afford a $250,000 house, or do I have to go to a $200,000 home? And that's kind of the process that we're in. Also, there's another slide on business investment real quickly, slide 25. This is one that Eric should like. At the tail end of last year, you had a lot of uncertainty what was going to happen to personal income taxes, and businesses did cut their new orders for non-defense capital goods. But after a brief lull, we've seen that come back up, and they're up about 8% year over year. Now, a lot of that's not on infrastructure. That's information and communications technology equipment. But I'd make the case that if we could just get dysfunctional Washington to agree on something, the underlying improvement in the economy is there.
Okay, good optimistic note after starting with a lot of talk about hot air. Eric, do you concur with that optimism, the fundamentals being strong, or are you worried about
No, as I said
bubbles?
9 months ago, I would have said we'd be in a very different place today if we could get through the issues that we're dealing with in the short term. I think the manufacturing one is a good example. I think the U.S. is poised. I don't know if I'd call it a manufacturing renaissance, but certainly we see a number of people bringing back manufacturing that we haven't seen in the U.S. in decades. I mean, who would have thought 5 or 6 years ago people would be building basic chemical plants in the U.S., steel plants? I mean, we just sold big automation systems to 2 steel mills, one in Ohio and one in Texas. I mean, nobody has been building steel mills in Youngstown, Ohio since the 50s. So I think that's a really good sign. So the cheap energy, the rising labor rates in Asia. I think the other big thing that we're now starting to see is the new manufacturing in the U.S. is going to be software-led. The U.S. is basically the motherland for software. 70% of all software is developed in the U.S. And we're seeing things like 3D printing, additive manufacturing. A lot of those things are going to take off. We're coming out with a number of new products with partners this year in that area. So I think you're going to see a huge growth there in some of those types of manufacturing, which I think will lead. But again, I think we need to get beyond this uncertainty. I mean, people want to know what the environment's going to look like, not just the next 6 months. They want to know what the next 5 and 10 years is going to look like.
We were talking made in America, weren't we? And Todd, if we're thinking about where do you invest, where do you look?
Depends on for what. In other words, if you're looking for growth markets, I wouldn't look to the Western world. If you're looking for,
you have to put your money in America.
Growth
you
market?
have to be in a growth market, or you have to be in something.
I would look for a growth industry. For instance, one of our favorite areas is in security. So regardless of fluctuations in GDP, security is growing, and so cyber theft and corporate and governmental counterintelligence.
Because Edward Snowden's blown the whole thing, we have to start again.
No, well, you know, things like the Arab Spring and so on, and something. There's an estimate it hovers around $300 to $400 billion of cyber theft annually and growing quickly. So it's an odd way to think of a growing industry, but that is an unambiguous growth industry. And so I'd rather invest in something like that than general equities, which I believe, as we've already said, are pumped up by cheap money, and that there's no real growth. In the United States, if you take the Fed stimulus away, there isn't any growth.
Harold.
So you think if the Fed stimulus was not there, some of the data that Ross just put up, the numbers might go the other way?
100%. I don't think you'd be buying as many cars if they weren't giving them away with 0% financing, and that's what created the housing crisis in the first place, and we're just right back there.
And so you think Ben Bernanke made the right decision and
well, he had to.
Shouldn't pull back anytime soon?
He had to then, but I think that they have to pull it back. I'm not sure how they get out of it, to be quite honest. We're kind of stuck here.
Anybody think we're going to start easing the taper this year?
December. Why do I say December?
That's your bet, okay.
All right.
Taking bets.
It's very easy. Ben Bernanke does not want to be known when he goes out to still have an extraordinary monetary policy in place. He wants to be able to say, I started to taper before I left office. That's my leading indicator.
Could I have one thing there?
Yeah.
The problem is that economic policy has been replaced by monetary policy. If you go back and look at the Fed, they were lender of last resort, and their mission was to fight inflation. Now they are manipulating all facets of the economy, including having very public opinions on the price of houses and stocks. And that came from Chairman Greenspan all the way to Bernanke. So they are now running economic policy, and there's no precedent for that. And the answer is just more QE, and that's unsustainable.
So the U.S. is drunk on easy money.
Absolutely. And when you take it away, you'll see what will happen.
You get the hangover. And you can't deal with the hangover at the same time
They
as
were
you deal with
supposed
the
to
fiscal
take-
crisis.
They were supposed to take the punch bowl away before the party ended, but they haven't done that yet.
I do think he's behaving like the only adult. When we talk about the dearth of adults on the political landscape, I do think he's shown. I mean, I don't know if he was as prescient as he thinks, knowing that we were going to face what we're facing now. But I do give Chairman Bernanke, whether you agree with him or not, a lot of credit on that front. I think that data will continue to determine the path of rates, and it could be December, but I don't see him. I don't see the taper beginning till end of next quarter. I've worked for a financial services firm. I don't speak on behalf of my firm, but I don't see the politics of it allowing him to do it. I don't see the economic policy allowing him to do it before next spring.
Greg, do you think that the U.S. economy needs more nursing? Do you think our gathering steam, we got a bit ahead of ourselves?
I don't disagree with anything that Todd just said. But what I do, I was just having a conversation with Jane Oates, who is a colleague of mine, just came out of the Obama administration, the Labor Department, and Jane said, Greg, we need 225,000 jobs in or about a month just to stay at par, right, with the labor market. And for anyone who doesn't know, there's about 132 or 3 million people in the U.S. labor force over the age of 25. I said, Jane, help me understand this. By any measure you read today, the research shows that there's 3.5 million jobs that are literally being advertised that can't be filled in the U.S. There's also a smaller skills gap here in the UK. How is it possible that there's 20-some million people on the sidelines, either unemployed or underemployed, and there's a skills gap to that size? We're talking about reinvigorating growth in America right now. Everybody wants growth. Everybody wants jobs. Well, there's job openings, and we're not filling the jobs. To me, it goes back to that labor force. There's over 80 million or 85 million that don't have post-secondary college degrees at the bachelor's level. You don't all need it, but you better have a skilled labor force so that Eric's company or anybody else's can go out and fill the demand today for the human capital to fuel growth. And all you have to, the problem now is we live in a global society, and we're competing globally, right, for jobs and for talent. We're spending, Mike Milken put up a slide last night, we spend 2% of household income in the US on our kids' education. They're spending 15 to 20 in China. And you want to compete with Samsung if you're Apple? Over 60% of that population's labor force over the age of 25 has a bachelor's degree.
And that's a really big long-term issue, isn't it? Wasn't it? I know you have the Empowering America, you've got a white paper coming out, but one of the stats you have right at the front of that paper is the US is 21st in terms of high school graduations.
That's correct. And we're 16th in terms of, outcomes out of college, graduation rates. Now, we built the system. If you want to know how we got to a $15 trillion economy in the US, go look from the late 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, where we added a year of education every decade to people's lives. We were out-educating the world in the 50s and 60s. It then sort of flatlined. In many categories, we've gone backwards. Now look what some other countries in the world have done, and start asking yourself, what's happened to America and our competitiveness in the world?
Yeah, I think this problem.
If I were Congress, that's where I'd be focused, coming together and saying, this is how we're going to be great again.
Yeah, I think this problem is real. We've had, in the past 2 or 3 years, we've opened several new manufacturing plants here. And all the new manufacturing plants are run by robots, lasers, computers. The jobs have changed so much in these plants. We've actually, in a couple of our plants now, started apprentice programs with local community colleges like we have in Germany. In Germany, at any one time, we have about 10,000 apprentices just for Siemens, not for the country, for Siemens.
You can't wait for the right graduates to come to you. You have to take matters into your own hands.
And Germany's got a dual system that takes care of that. Here, we can't find the people to go into those skilled production jobs, coming out of school. So we've actually started at the community colleges programs so people, go to school part-time, work part-time. They're guaranteed a job if they graduate. They don't have debt. And they come out and start at a job that pays more than the average salary of someone who gets a 4-year degree from a liberal arts school in this country. We have too many kids graduating from 4-year colleges who can't find jobs, or at least can't find jobs in the areas that they want. We've got this mismatch, and I think that some of the areas we're talking about expanding, manufacturing, as I said before, has a big opportunity here. But we're going to need a lot more skilled people in the areas like IT and computer programming and engineering if we really want to see that take off in this country. Otherwise, you're going to see Samsung having a big advantage over U.S. companies, and that's why manufacturing will go abroad, because the best companies in the world marry their manufacturing and their R&D. Well, the big mistake we made, we thought we wanted to become a service economy, was let all the manufacturing go offshore. What happens is then the R&D goes offshore and a lot of the innovation goes offshore, which is why if you take a look at a lot of things out there today, like a lot of the clean technologies, battery technology, et cetera, we had the lead in that 25 years ago, no more, right?
Harold, how much do you think this is where politicians should get out of the way? Because you've always got that problem, haven't you, between people looking at primaries, looking at fundraising, looking at re-election, and then we're talking about some really long-term issues here in terms of economic fundamentals.
Well, government has been a central part of this conversation for a long time. I mean, you listen to the last panel, some of the things that Mr. Milken talked about with Tony Blair and the others. I mean, we don't have a national innovation policy in the country, which we should have, which speaks to some of Greg's points. It's shameful and pathetic. Not only do we not have an innovation policy and education policy to try to marry jobs with trying to create the skill set so people can marry up with the jobs that make sense. We don't even, we've reached a point now where we're not even training people for where they may be working, the jobs that are coming along down the pike, we're relying on the private sector to create these opportunities and to try to ensure that they're training workers, and government's playing no role today. I think the problem is we have a short-sighted Congress, a short-sighted political system, and it'll change. We go through these cycles, and you know, 5 years ago when President Obama took office, I'll never forget friends of mine who were clearly very bright guys, some of them very wealthy, but obviously had never seen an inaugural address, said President Obama gave the greatest inaugural address I ever heard back in '09. They said he talked about bringing people together and working with Congress and introducing all these new ideas. And all I could think was, my friend's never seen an inaugural address. There's never been a president to stand before the country and say, this glorious privilege you've given me, thank you. I cannot wait to depart the United States Capitol, march down Pennsylvania Avenue, and I promise the American people that I will send a piece of legislation back here later today that will divide, antagonize, and anger America like never before. We always talk about bringing people together. You got to have leaders that are willing to do that. Frankly, had the president chosen, and I'm for the president, but had the president allocated more time early on with jobs and education instead of the health care bill the first 9 months, we would be having a different conversation. If Obama and Boehner had figured out a way to close the gap back in '11 with their big budget deal, they were $150 billion apart over 10 years. Had they been able to close that, we'd be having a fundamentally different conversation about a lot of different things.
What about the ways in which the framework is being changed? So if you're not, we were talking about the problem of not having career-ready skill sets. What about bringing more investment in for smaller companies? The Jobs Act, for example, you know, having opened things up so there can be more investors, more IPOs, get a bit of movement there. What do you think?
I want to follow on that for 1 sec. So back to the issue of monetary policy versus economic policy, I think Congress should get involved here because rather than buying $80 billion of mortgages every month, as the Fed is, we have trillions of dollars offshore that if you had a tax holiday and say, bring it back, but half the money has to go into education and training, you'd fund it in the private sector and you'd have a meaningful effect right away. So that's economic policy.
That's what I like to see the Republicans do, is change the negotiation to a pro-growth strategy. So the U.S. now has the highest corporate tax rate in the world, right? The marginal tax rate. The effective rate is lower. And there's general agreement on both sides of the aisle. I've sat and talked to them in private. And yet we can't seem to get it done because the Republicans don't want to be seen as the Democrats giving it to them, right? And so the negotiation, the deal just doesn't work.
So instead we just keep buying mortgages.
Yeah, keep buying mortgages.
Pumping up the stock market.
And this is where I think presidential leadership is so important. Only point I was trying to make. If the president were to make the case, you could find a deal. There are enough Republicans who want corporate tax reform. Yeah. I mean, that might, I mean, if I were president, I would pray we wouldn't be in the position we're in now, but I'd go to Republicans and say, look, put aside all this Obamacare stuff. Let me give you a corporate tax rate drop to 25 and let's get this done. I mean, serious people, what I think we lack are just serious people in politics today. You have to negotiate. Everybody doesn't get their way 100%. That's called childhood. This is not like real life stuff. You can't operate this way in your business. I wish I could get 100. My wife is pregnant with our first kid. I have no control. I thought I had that much control before. I have no control in my house now, and I may perhaps I'm projecting here, but I think people have to be willing to understand the truth. Her ears are ubiquitous, but she's back in the States. But people have to be willing to negotiate, and we all know what Republicans want, and Republicans have a sense of what Democrats want, and so I'm disappointed with
Ronald Reagan to me earlier, because we were talking Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill. You know, and you're saying one of the things to watch as well is who's getting invited to the White House, who is sitting down.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, Chris Matthews got a new book out on Reagan and O'Neill. I don't make any money off it, but it's a pretty good little read talking about how it used to work, Tip and the Gipper, and how they were able to come together and work together. We need that again to happen for all these issues to be addressed. And I think government has to play a central role, not getting in the way, but it has to play a central role, whether it's providing fair, understandable, consistent tax, an easy to understand tax code or regulatory policy, whatever it may be.
What about the way that government talks to the business community, the vibes between Washington and Wall Street? I mean, Todd, a lot of the problem now, as you were saying, is eye of the storm, lack of certainty, nobody really wants to leap forward.
Well, I mean, we in the investment community are villains now. You didn't know that? and so
you put me right.
it's suddenly a bad place to be. But the administration, the political body has to marry with the investment community, and it's just been antagonistic. And so that leadership, I think, is sorely lacking at the moment, because without Wall Street, Main Street suffers. And so to demonize Wall Street is just a political moment, and that does nobody any good. Without functioning capital markets and capital incentives, it just doesn't work. And so the role of Wall Street has been obviously seminal and growing in the history of America. So I mean,
I think the term you're looking for is fat cats on Wall Street.
I thought that was your term.
Sorry.
When I said, where should investors look? You know, where is positive? What should we look at? What are the trends? Another phrase that I hear is, energy renaissance. There's a growth area. We've maybe talked about manufacturing. There's healthcare. This is the day when the exchanges, this still works, doesn't it? Yeah, when the exchanges go live with Obamacare. And Eric, I know this is all energy, for example, and the new healthcare structure is something that you're involved with as well. I mean, these are upward tick. This is growth, isn't it?
Well, I think the healthcare reform is another big area of uncertainty. I mean, today it's kicking off. It goes into effect first of the year. Nobody really knows for sure how the transformation is going to go forward. Will the exchanges work? There's a medical device tax, which I see the Republicans lobbed in yesterday onto the approval. That's going to cost us this year 2.3%. It's going to cost us about $80 million off the bottom line, just the medical device tax, which means you got to make that up somewhere. You got to make that up in R&D. You got to make it up in jobs. You got to make it up in somewhere. So all these things, I think, are creating a lot of uncertainty. And what you're seeing in the healthcare industry is a lot of consolidation, a lot of shrinkage in terms of a lot of the big in the markets and everything. Healthcare spending is down, but I think a lot of that is down at, I think 3.9% is at its lowest level, but I think it's just all the uncertainty. People aren't spending money because they want to see what's going to happen with the new law. I'm not sure that structurally the new law is driving down costs yet. I mean, we don't have enough information about that yet. So again, it's another area where, you don't know where the industry is going. You don't know where consumers are going. You don't know if these exchanges are going to work. You don't know if companies are going to basically opt out of the system. Just a lot of uncertainty, and that drives a lot less people buying the kinds of things we sell, health IT, medical devices, diagnostic equipment, et cetera. So again, it's just another area, and that means, okay, we're going to spend less money on investment, we're going to slow down plants, we're not selling as much equipment, right? It's all linked together.
There are so many factors here, I know, and being a journalist, I'm just about to simplify massively, but is there I feel as if we may be at a tipping point. We're talking about, the next crisis is debt ceiling. Is the US going to default, and how much of a crisis would that be?
Well, if we truly defaulted, it would be a major crisis. It's never happened in the modern era in the United States. Look, the Treasury has a number of ways it can continue to pay interest on the debt, and I think it will. It could go on for a while with a partial government shutdown, but it's back to the issue of the lack of confidence. Businesses in that environment are not going to make that bet on the marginal investment. And so that's where the question mark comes from. So, we were debating whether or not on October 1, whether the government would be in a partial shutdown or not. We noticed the date. It wasn't any coincidence. All right. So we looked at that, and I said we got to add a question mark. I'm the eternal optimist, right? But what if the government does shut down?
If you take the optimistic point of view and you say, okay, we've had the political head-to-head over the shutdowns happened, perhaps the Tea Party is happier because of it, then maybe the adults do come out, or maybe then you get to the point where people say, you cannot default, there cannot be, come to blows over the debt ceiling in the way we have over the shutdown. And Harold, do you feel that this could be, if a deal is finally done over the debt ceiling, so many other things follow?
Could it be momentum?
Yeah.
Probably not. I would hope, but I doubt it. No. Yeah. So I share Ross's optimism, but I don't. What I don't share is optimism that they'll get a win and keep going. I'd say two quick things. One, I think the posture and rhetoric of this administration around business, and I separate Wall Street from Main Street a little bit. I do agree Main Street can't succeed unless you have capital markets that are working and people have confidence in them and people are not being demonized who work in them. But the posture of the administration has been terrible towards business. The actual policies have not been as bad. I remember when Obama was first elected, one of the big concerns, I remember having a meeting with some CEOs of some very big retailers, including Walmart and Lowe's. Their big concern was whether or not Democrats would pass card check, which would make it easier for their workers to unionize. It never materialized. Even the taxes that people were deeply concerned about, Obama extended them. He was forced to extend because Democrats suffered at the polls, but he extended what were called the Bush tax cuts. George Bush would tell you the Bush tax cuts would have been extended if they were not called the Bush tax cuts, but they extended them after 2010. He didn't hurt business in any way. 3, if I'd have told you 5 years ago today that the next president of the United States would oversee one of the great transformations, one of the great geographic pivots when it comes to energy, and we would lead the world in exploration and production, you'd probably look at me and say, Dick Cheney will not be the next president of the United States. This president, through a number of things, has found himself in a position where a lot of these things are happening. Now, we talk about a deal. The Republicans want to end Obamacare. He's not going to end Obamacare on a debt thing, but they ought to go to him and say, give us the Keystone Pipeline and we'll go with you, or give us a corporate tax cut. And then you would have big parts of the country rallying around saying, hey, you know what, that's some regulatory certainty and some things we want to do. But again, what I'm hoping is if they cut a deal that way, then maybe some momentum will gather. But we're heading into an election season. I hate to oversimplify it, but I think, everyone's going to be positioning for their primaries and obviously positioning for the November races.
I want to add a point because I think we need more people like you in Congress and Congressman Ford. But
I'm not going back there.
You sure?
Just there might be a senator seat come open soon.
One thing I just want to point out in terms of compromise, and this is just one example. This is in a lot of sectors, and I want the president to succeed very much so, like all Americans, I think, most. But regulation in our country, you can say what you want about how it's swung. The pendulum, is way too far to one side. In my sector of education, during the first term, 500 new regulations. So and at one point I worked, for 15 years on Wall Street, very regulated business. I understand it's necessary. Good regulation is necessary, but when you get to the point where you feel, don't ask the question, why is there $2-3 trillion sitting on the sidelines? Understand it is very, very difficult. We've made it harder to do business, in our country. And that's something, this panel was to talk about is growth, are we moving into growth here? That's something that if it's addressed will make it much easier. I'm writing 45,000 paychecks every couple weeks. And I'll tell you, I want to write a lot more, but it's very difficult to grow in the U.S. right now with that much regulation that's hanging over your head.
Let alone Dodd-Frank, which even the most conservatively run banks will tell you is impossible to even understand what it says, let alone to comply with it. The costs are incredible.
If you could wave a magic wand and do, have 2 wishes that would make it, easier for growth in the U.S., what are you
I'll say something completely crazy. I think we should have a one-party system for 1 year.
A technocratic
just
government.
take 100 things, just get rid of all of them, and then get back to fighting. But we're just stuck. But,
give me something more useful.
Well, that's pretty useful. That's pretty useful. The only thing that I've even heard post-crisis actually came from the Milken Institute and Richard Lafrac, which was open the borders, give automatic U.S. citizenship to people who can buy a house legitimately, cash, real buyers, because a lot of those buyers we showed on the graph before are private equity firms. It's not all end users buying homes. And now all those people needed a GE refrigerator and a GM car and so on. That is the only economic policy concept that I heard through this whole thing. Instead, we just decided to nationalize the bond market, the mortgage market, and I think now the stock market and pretty much the housing market. So
my top one would be to reduce the corporate income tax rate, but number 2 would actually add income to the Treasury. We have outdated controls on our exports. This affects Eric's business as well, because I've known many companies that have tried to sell products to even Israel, let alone China or India. So they come from the Cold War era, where you're not allowed to sell an advanced computer chip or anything that contains that to the Chinese without being granted this export license. All right, and it's a very cumbersome process. Well, many of our European friends are selling the same products. I know, for example, in Illinois, where a firm had developed a new technology for laser-guided cutting and machine tools, and they were going to ramp up production, and they wanted to export to Asia, principally China. They actually had to transfer the ownership of intellectual property to Germany to be able to manufacture the product and sell it to China. And this is U.S. technology, and we're doing that to ourselves.
Often you say that we're fighting the wrong battles, you know, or asking the wrong questions. And when you talk about, for example, let's open the borders, let's be genuinely open to skilled immigrants, you know, that's just not the kind of thing that's really being discussed in the policy-making circles. I mean, Eric, anything that strike you that would
I think the biggest thing is,
on?
For things we're doing and for our customers is get rid of the uncertainty by making a decision. At some point, I don't really care which way you make it. Keystone, yes or no? Because if you say no, they'll cancel that one, but they're gonna go two other ways with it, right? And that's going to create investment. It's going to drive jobs. It's going to create, I mean, there's thousands of those projects out there. I mean, just pipelines in this country. There's probably half a dozen or dozen multi-billion-dollar pipelines that are just kind of sitting there waiting for the State Department, EPA, the new EPA regs. Okay, either they're going in or they're not going in. Okay, because right now there's just a big battle going on. Now they're saying 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It's delaying. Are we going to be able to run these coal plants? Or we're not going to be able to run these coal plants.
You're asking for bold leadership. At which point I'll say you might have the wrong constitution.
Yeah, but
I disagree with that. We have the right constitution. We need some new personnel. We got the right constitution. Hope I get out of London okay.
Well, and just to maybe add on to the point, if you thought a little bit more about how successful corporations run and grow over time, they put the right strategy in place, they execute relentlessly, and they're accountable. And all three of those things have to happen. And I'm not sure that they always happen, from the personnel that we have in the government. And that's why just make a decision and go. Let's get something done. And I think you watch the interviews on CNN, today about this shutdown, and people are very, very angry and frustrated.
If I could do three things, I'd approve the Keystone Pipeline, I'd cut the corporate tax rate to 25%, I'd raise the eligibility age in Social Security to 70, and raise the age under Medicare and means test both of the programs.
Amen. I read your op-ed in the Wall Street Journal.
So that's substantive, but it's psychological as well, isn't it? It's about let's break the logjam, as you were saying.
Exactly.
Let's start moving.
There's a slide 48 up there. I'm on the Business Roundtable, and they just did their third quarter survey. I don't know if we have that slide. It wasn't in the original packet, but the most recent survey of the Business Roundtable, executive confidence is down. It's below, I think, a little bit below the long-run average. And in the discussions we had at the Business Roundtable, people, the executives were saying, this is 250 of the largest companies in the country, I think about half the GDP in the country, big banks, big manufacturing, big consumer good companies, et cetera. And executives were saying, who would have thought, with all the cheap capital we've had, an energy boom going on, that we'd be sitting here 4 years into a recovery saying, we're not creating any jobs, there's no growth in the country, and we're sitting here saying we're pretty depressed about the situation, such that our confidence in the economy in the U.S. is below the long-run average. I mean, you couldn't imagine that's where we would be if you ran the clock back a couple of years ago, right? And so the question is, with all this cheap capital, and you were saying we're almost 2% or whatever. I mean, the last time we had this much cheap capital available after World War II, there was just a huge run-up in the economy. Why isn't it? And to your point, when they start moving away from it, what's going to happen? So if we don't get out of this logjam with the uncertainty and the easy money goes away, what the hell is going to happen to the economy then? I mean, that's got to be a big concern. And that's what I think a lot of companies are sitting there saying, is this the time, do I move more chips to the U.S. or do I not move more chips to the U.S.?
But the capital back then was invested in industry, in manufacturing.
Right.
And now the capital is invested in financial assets. So you have financial asset inflation, which is not really getting us anywhere. And from Greenspan to Bernanke, they believe that a very high stock market will produce a trickle-down effect in the economy. Well, it's not working.
Right.
Is it just a fact that if you're a very...
What happens if it goes down? Because that never happens.
Is it a fact that if you're a very high net worth value investor, you are not really looking at the States at the moment?
Personally?
Generally, in terms of strategy?
Well, it's hard to say. I think it just in general, if you were to think about the U.S. equities, you're at record highs, and for what reason other than cheap capital? There's no particular growth, so I'm not sure that would be a great strategy. But of course, you always have new winners. Over the last 10 years, notwithstanding the last year, you had basically a zero IRR in the S&P with a huge volatility, and yet if you had put all your money in Apple and Google, you made money. Right, so there are always some winners who are the real innovators, but you have to be a pretty savvy stock picker for that.
There's something that I'd like to add to that. You just said real innovators, and Clay Christensen, who's a professor at Harvard, has an incredible example on. If you look at history, over the dollars and the number of innovators that we had in the U.S. and the things that they innovated, and what happened to the economy because of that. To where those innovations now, instead of building new companies, those innovations now are how to make things cheaper or more efficient, right? There's more innovation in that area. Those don't create a lot of jobs.
It's about refining.
Yes. Where we need leadership in our country, I think, to push forward is let's innovate and create and build new things in our country. We can teach that, but we need people moving together, in Washington to say, here's how we become
and
great
it's about
again.
getting away from an outsourcing mindset as well, perhaps.
I think so. I think, that there's always a place for outsourcing in certain areas, but you can't make it the central theme for becoming more efficient in the country and then expect to have job growth.
Yeah.
Right?
Imagine if you had fiscal policy to match that and you say 0% capital gains for the next 5 years.
We had an education
That would
summit
encourage capital.
in London earlier this year, and some members of the government came, and we had leaders of corporations from all over the UK come and sit in a room together. And one of the most fascinating remarks that I will remember for a long time was, I think it was one of the leaders of BT, British Telecom, who said, and I'll leave the names out, but somebody in your government.
No, feel free.
And said, I would like to understand why you in this government, and this was a person high up in the education department here, are not Ministry of Education, are not partnering with industry, because I got 6,000 jobs that I need to put on this project now, and I can't get the labor right now, so I'm going to go outside the country. Why are you not partnering with industry to make this happen for me right now? And everybody in the room just kind of went, that's a tough one to answer. How do I argue with that?
And talking of tough questions and answers, we're going to end where we began, with me asking Harold a question where I want you to tell us how long you think the government shutdown is going to last.
I think between now and October 17th, because that's the debt ceiling when Secretary Lew says we may not have enough funds to cover. So I think the next 2 weeks, and Todd said it well, I think we're kind of at one of the most tumultuous points. So again, I'm optimistic.
If you had to bet on October 17th, on some sort of deal being reached?
I wouldn't recommend betting on these guys, but I do think that between now and I don't think they're going to allow us to default. I do think that you'll have a group of responsible Republicans and Democrats who will come together. I mean, I have not seen a lot of the talk back and forth today. I think the way the president's posture is towards Republicans today is important. I hope he doesn't pile on. I mean, I think they look like they look, and let's try to get to a resolution here. And I hope that everybody can be serious and mature, and I'm hoping for a lot.
Okay. We may end this session then with crossed fingers, and I think I may call it Eye of the Storm. But thank you all very much.
You were wonderful too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you very much.